Live from Washington, D.C., this is Balance of Power with Joe Mathieu.
A last-ditch attempt at diplomacy. Welcome to the Friday edition of Balance of Power as Iran's foreign minister meets with European leaders in Geneva after President Trump allowed 2 weeks for a diplomatic solution with Iran. We're going to get the latest for you straight ahead from Bloomberg's Nick Wadhams with insights today from Dan Kurtzer, the former U.S. ambassador to Israel. Analysis this hour from our political panel. Bloomberg Politics contributor, Republican strategist Rick Davis is with us, along with Democratic strategist Matt Bennett at Third Way. It's all after a look at Wall Street. Back to it today, the Friday trade with Charlie Pellet at World Headquarters in New York. Charlie, what do you have for us?
Right now, we are looking at a down day on the S&P 500 index. An update for the Dow. Joe Mathieu up by 0.2%. NASDAQ in the red, down 65, a decline there of just about 0.3%. A fresh bout of instability gripping the stock market amid a slide in chip makers, and as a pile of options expiring today threaten to trigger sudden price swings. Treasuries paired losses as Fed Governor Christopher Waller said rates could drop as early as July. We've got the 10-year at 4.37%. The 2-year is currently yielding 3.89%. Spot gold, little changed on the day, up 70 cents to $33.71 the ounce. West Texas Intermediate crude oil down 0.3%, 74.95 a barrel on WTI. Bitcoin, meanwhile, trading lower by 0.5%, 103,690 on Bitcoin. Do want to pass along a headline that we just got from Meta Platforms. Meta had acquisition talks with Perplexity before that Scale deal. Meta Platform shares, they're down now by just about 0.8%. American and European airlines have begun pausing flights to destinations in the Persian Gulf as Israel's conflict with Iran enters its second week, and the U.S. mulls joining the attacks on Iranian nuclear sites. Shares of American Airlines up 0.3%. United Airlines Holdings, that stock down by 0.1%. Again, recapping, S&P 500 index now flat on the day. Balance of Power continues right now, and back we go to Washington. Once again, your host, here he is, Joe Mathieu.
All right, Charlie, great to see you. Live from New York, Charlie Pellet on the markets. We'll get back with Charlie on the Friday trade a bit later on this hour as we get back to business here on Balance of Power, here on Bloomberg TV and radio, live on YouTube and Bloomberg Originals as well. Thanks for joining us as we look for the way forward here when it comes to Iran, along with a couple of other issues. But this is the story we're going to stick with as an important meeting gets underway today in Geneva with Iran's foreign minister, and we're now calling the E3, the leaders of Britain, France, and Germany, all after yesterday's revelation by President Trump that we now have 2 weeks of breathing room to find a diplomatic solution. There were questions when we last spoke on Wednesday, of course, about whether a U.S. strike against Iran was imminent. We heard from the White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt yesterday on this. 2 weeks it is.
If the U.S. were to take some type of military action, would the president go to Congress to seek war authority?
I'm not going to engage in hypotheticals. I gave you the statement from the president. He'll make a decision within 2 weeks.
Simple as that, as we bring in Nick Wadhams on the conversation, who leads our national security team here in Washington. Nick, it's great to see you. This has been a pretty interesting process, and now we've got a meeting underway with the chance for a diplomatic solution. It's unclear what exactly motivated President Trump to allow for the 2 weeks, but when you hear from Iran's foreign minister actually making tracks to Geneva, what does that tell us?
It could tell us a lot, or it could tell us nothing. I mean, I think the thing that's really interesting from the Caroline Leavitt statement is she says within 2 weeks, and it's like, well, if you start to actually parse that, it's like, well, what does that mean? I mean, the interpretation had been, okay, they're giving us a 2 week reprieve. But then she's saying within, which means it really could happen at any time. Okay. So it does give the president a little breathing room, because there had been, as we and many others have reported, the conventional wisdom was that these strikes were going to happen this weekend. Mm-hmm. And a lot of anticipation for that. She now seems to be broadening out the time horizon. What does seem clear is the president has not made a final decision. But the issue of the Iranian foreign minister meeting the Europeans, in some ways, I see that as almost as like a last ditch effort, but the president has been very dismissive of European efforts in large part. He really wants this to be a U.S.-Iran conversation. So it's not clear to me what Iran could say in that meeting that would persuade him to hold off.
So he may not find that a deal with the Europeans is credible to begin with. You just left them in Canada to think about it. You were there, as a matter of fact. But interesting to hear from the UK Foreign Minister David Lammy on X. He wrote, "The situation in the Middle East remains perilous." And this is following a meeting with Marco Rubio and Steve Witkoff. He writes, "We're determined that Iran must never have a nuclear weapon." Meeting with Rubio and Witkoff at the White House today, we discussed how a deal could avoid a deepening conflict. A window now exists within the next 2 weeks to achieve a diplomatic solution. Is it his job to express that kind of optimism, or was there a feeling in the room that we might have avoided a war?
I think what you're seeing here is officials from everywhere, whether it's the U.S. and non-officials like Steve Bannon or Tucker Carlson, and now the U.K. and others, basically trying to triangulate and get messages to Trump. I mean, whenever we talk to people about, well, what is he going to do? Will he, won't he? The response is always, it really depends on who the last person was he spoke to. So this is the sort of infamous or famous way that Trump does business. He has a lot of ideas, but then it often comes down to who got to him last. So I think what you're seeing from the UK there is, in some ways, the government in the UK has tried to play the role of not necessarily peacemaker, but hey, let's take a breath here. Keir Starmer, the prime minister, said a couple days ago he believed the president was not going to attack. Now you have this nascent effort by the Europeans. Okay, let's just take a breath. Let's have this little window. Let's see if we can get something done. But the president himself has said, you know, essentially that it was too late. Iran had 60 days, and that's what led to this Israeli strike. Counter that against the idea of him as the deal maker. There's no one who wants a deal more than Donald Trump wants a deal. He would love to get a deal here. The question is there anything that Iran can say now that is going to satisfy him and make him say, okay, I mean, a meeting with the Europeans right now, I'm not really sure what Iran could do short of saying, okay, we are going to give up all of our aspirations for a nuclear, which, you know, they're probably not going to do.
Okay, so we have 2 weeks. The conventional wisdom on Wednesday was you need B-2 bombers with these MOP bombs to get to Fordo and the sensitive enrichment facility under a mountain in Israel. Now there's this idea, well, what if Benjamin Netanyahu has 2 weeks and he might actually send special forces inside that complex? Donald Trump doesn't need to put Americans in harm's way. Is he allowing for that possibility?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, you can imagine what the conversations look like in the White House as the president says, okay, what are my options? What's the best case scenario? What's the worst case scenario? I mean, yes, they have air dominance, but there is still a potential risk that a U.S. plane could get shot down. U.S. service members' lives could be lost. Obviously, the question of, okay, if you do this strike from this bomb, we believe it would have a devastating impact. It might not have a devastating impact. We don't know. This weapon is largely unproven in a situation like this. So no guarantee that it would have the effect the U.S. wants it to have. Suddenly the U.S., the administration is pulled deeper into this conflict. What if then U.S. bases are attacked? So he's getting advice from a lot of folks who say, oh, yeah, just go in, drop the 30,000-pound bomb, done, dusted, we're good to go, American involvement over. Yeah. He's also presumably getting a lot of information from folks who say high risk, potentially low reward. And then the Israelis have said publicly, we have plenty of options here. You know, there are other ways of doing this, special forces being one of them. So obviously difficult to get inside the president's head, but you can be sure he's getting a lot of very different information.
A lot of worries about the day after, as they call it.
Day after,
what would Iran do to strike back, forcing continued U.S. involvement? Or what would happen if an American aircrew were shot down?
And it goes against everything the president campaigned on. I mean, yes, peace through strength, that's a big one. But, you know, he billed himself as the peace president. I mean, I cannot tell you the number of times I sat through campaign rallies and also conversations with his advisors. No new wars in the first term. Suddenly the president is potentially going to war with Iran. I mean, that's really going to undercut the message he has sent and a lot of the support he gets from the MAGA base.
Yeah, it's not lost on us that Steve Bannon had lunch at the White House yesterday. Nick, great to see you. Nick Wadhams, Bloomberg's national security team leader, with us here in Washington. As we read the tea leaves with 2 weeks out, or maybe less, as Nick identified, the language here, the semantics are important. Within 2 weeks is what the press secretary said. We had the voice of experience in Dan Kurtzer, now with Princeton University, where he's professor of Middle East policy. He's former U.S. ambassador to Israel and has been in the room for talks like the ones we're describing today in Geneva. Mr. Ambassador, welcome back to Bloomberg TV and radio. It's great to have you. Do you share the optimism of the UK foreign minister when it comes to these talks today in Geneva?
Well, there's no basis to be optimistic unless they've heard something from the Iranians that they'll communicate to the president. What they need to hear, and what the president would need to hear, is that the Iranians are ready to come back to the talks and understand that they will have to give up enrichment on Iranian soil. If the Europeans can produce that kind of a commitment, then the president can talk to Netanyahu about holding up a little bit and giving diplomacy a chance. But otherwise, aspirations are nice, but we're really far down the road beyond simply hope.
Well, you hear the phrase unfettered access, and it brings you back to the nuclear deal with Iran and to years long before that, and even to Iraq. You remember how this goes with weapons inspectors, and it's typically not to meet expectations. With Iran, they've turned back on a number of promises before. Why would this time be any different?
Well, the reality is that in 2015, with the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, for 3 years, the Iranians adhered to that agreement. And each time a small violation was uncovered, it was fixed right away. So there is at least a small track record of Iranian compliance, which of course ended when the United States pulled out of the JCPOA. Now, I think that we would need a much stronger JCPOA 2.0. We'd have to have no end date. You remember the JCPOA was supposed to come to an end within 12 to 15 years. So no end date, better assurances with regard to the reconstitution of the program. But, a tougher agreement could lead to Iranian compliance, an end of the war, and therefore an end of the Iranian nuclear program.
Is Iran more or less likely to agree to stop enriching uranium as it is being bombed by Israel? Is this maximum pressure campaign the type of thing that works in this scenario, or moves Iran further away from an agreement like that?
Well, it's a great question, and the answer is unknown. Before the Israeli bombing, Iran was stuck on the idea that it would not give up the right to enrich uranium. So we don't know whether the debilitation of Iran's military capabilities, its missile program, and its nuclear program will now make a convincing argument otherwise. I think much of this is going to depend on what's happening within the opaque system in Tehran. The Ayatollah still is calling the shots, but there are quite a few different factions playing in this, including more extreme elements in the Iranian Revolutionary Guards and the so-called Basij, who have argued for years that Iran should simply develop a nuclear weapon. So they will be pressing for that. Others might say, look, we invested a lot, we lost a lot, we have no allies in the region, and it's time to give it up.
There's been some interesting reporting on U.S. intelligence estimates when it comes to Iran's ability to and motivation to make a nuclear weapon. We are frequently not on the same page as Israel when it comes to this, Ambassador, and I wonder your thoughts about the assessment we're reading about today that Iran has yet to decide whether to make a nuclear bomb, even though it does, in fact, have a large stockpile of enriched uranium. The idea is that it would be more likely to shift toward producing a bomb if the U.S. decides to get involved offensively with Israel. Do you believe that to be true?
Well, our intelligence community has been consistent since 2003 in saying that Iran is not trying to weaponize the capability of using a nuclear weapon. And that was something that Tulsi Gabbard back in, I guess was March, April, testified to Congress. And it's something that the president simply said he didn't agree with, even though it's his intelligence people telling him that. So you have to distinguish between the weaponization program, which appears not to be in place, as opposed to the preparatory steps that Iran has been taking and accelerating since 2018, since we pulled out of the JCPOA, and they started enriching at a much higher level, up to 60%. And there's some indication that at least at one point they went beyond 60%, which would bring them very, very close to being a threshold nuclear state with a breakout time that's essentially days, not even weeks. So they're prepared, I think, to move expeditiously. Their capabilities are much less today as a result of Israeli bombing. Question is, how do you make sure that what Israel accomplished militarily is sustainable and that Iran cannot reconstitute its program?
So, Ambassador, what do you expect to take place then in the next 2 weeks? And if the U.S. managed to strike a deal with Iran, would Israel trust it?
Well, what I expect to take place is a lot of back-channel conversations. We know that the president's envoy, Stephen Witkoff, has tried to reach out to the Iranians. We now have this European meeting. There's going to be a lot of chatter behind the scenes, and I think the president will factor that into the equation. Are the Iranians really ready as a result of having been bruised? Are they really ready to come to the table and give up enrichment, which would make a JCPOA 2.0 possible? Whether Netanyahu would be satisfied with that? Look, as far as the Israelis are concerned, unless Fordow is taken out, the heavily fortified underground facility, they think their job won't be done. As Nick suggested, there may be other ways of doing it besides simply B-2 bombing. You knock out the electricity, the entrances, the air supply, and you keep at it for a while. So you're going to see, I think, in these 2 weeks, back-channel contacts, sustained Israeli attacks, including against Fordow. And within that 2-week period, whether the president can put this all together in a diplomatic package is literally anyone's guess at this point.
Wow. Wouldn't want to be a worker at Fordow right now. Ambassador, we just ran a headline across the terminal. The Iran-European nuclear talks in Geneva have come to an end. We are standing by for a statement as we wait for a readout. And in our final moment here together, Ambassador, where's Russia and China on this? Or are we learning right now that they have no influence on what's happening?
Well, they certainly have little influence. The Chinese are heavily dependent on Iran's oil and gas, and therefore they're concerned whether this war escalates and whether attacks against the energy infrastructure take place, or whether Iran, in response, blocks the Straits of Hormuz. So the Chinese are nervous. The Russians are incapacitated because of their own war. But nonetheless, it would behoove the president to think about including them in any multilateral diplomatic approach. After all, it was the Russians, Chinese, and the 3 Europeans who joined us in 2015 to make the JCPOA work at that time. So they're not going to be major players in this, but they'll be important players if Iran sees that not just the Europeans and the Americans, but also their friends in Moscow and Beijing are telling them it's time to call it quits.
Great to have you with us, sir. Dan Kurtzer, former U.S. ambassador to Israel, now at Princeton, with us here on Balance of Power. This is Bloomberg. Make sure to subscribe to the Balance of Power podcast. Go to Apple, Spotify, anywhere else you get your podcasts, and hear our full conversation with former Ambassador Dan Kurtzer. Listen anytime at Bloomberg.com. Live from World Headquarters in New York, the voice of Wall Street and the New York subway, in fact. Great to have you with us on the Friday edition of Balance of Power. Here on Bloomberg TV and radio, on the Bloomberg Professional app, Bloomberg Originals, and on YouTube, where you can find us right now by searching Bloomberg Business News Live. Waiting for decisions to come from the White House on any number of matters. Yes, that includes tariffs. 9th of July is the deadline. Remember, the clock was ticking on a 90-day extension. We now have a 2-week extension, effectively, on talks with Iran. And we're just getting headlines now, in fact, on talks that were held today in Geneva, not with the U.S., but Iran's foreign minister sitting down with the E3, leaders from Britain, France, Germany, to talk about potentially finding a diplomatic solution here. And the UK's foreign minister says that he seeks more Iran contact, urging Tehran to talk to the U.S. David Lammy suggesting optimism after he met with Marco Rubio and Steve Witkoff at the White House yesterday, putting on X, a window now exists within the next 2 weeks to achieve a diplomatic solution. There you see it on Bloomberg TV, optimism. To suggest that Steve Witkoff or Secretary Rubio might end up at a negotiating table with Iran has yet to be seen. Donald Trump, just as recently as Wednesday, suggesting that he had not made up his mind and that no one knows what he wants to do when it comes to potential U.S. involvement here, offensive military involvement against Iran. Here he is.
You don't know that I'm going to even do it. You don't know. I may do it. I may not do it. I mean, nobody knows what I'm going to do. I can tell you this, that Iran's got a lot of trouble.
Iran's got a lot of trouble as we assemble our political panel. Bloomberg Politics contributor, Republican strategist Rick Davis is here, partner at Stonecourt Capital, alongside Democratic strategist Matt Bennett from Third Way. Gentlemen, great to have both of you with us here. Rick, I don't know what it is about 2 weeks that the president is always reaching for when he needs some breathing room. But you wonder if this has a lot to do with MAGA, having lunched with Steve Bannon yesterday, MAGA urging for restraint in this case. Is he trying to show his most faithful supporters that he gave diplomacy every chance?
Yeah, this is something that is really fascinating about this presidency is his own supporters don't mind criticizing him about decisions they believe might be in violation of the promises he made on the campaign trail. And this is prima facie evidence of that. And so, it's no question in the back of his mind. I think it's evidence that Steve Bannon going over to the White House, one of his firmest critics on this issue of opening up a military front in Iran, is gotten to him. Look, I think it's an interesting device that Donald Trump uses when he feels under pressure. He kicks the can, right? He doesn't hunker down and try to make a decision. He just delays for time. And on its own, it's a strategic idea. The downside to Donald Trump is it just leaves more lobbying room, more public and private negotiations to take place within his own ruling coalition, if you want to call it that, before you ever get to the point of figuring out, okay, what are we going to do to Iran to stop them from being able to enrich uranium. So, I mean, it's I think we're going to be up for at least the next 10 days, a incredibly troublesome process because Donald Trump likes to think out loud. And that's going to throw a lot of different curveballs into this system.
What is it about 2 weeks, Matt Bennett? Sean McCreesh in the New York Times this morning suggesting that it is a slippery thing when it comes to Trump, not a measurement of time so much as a placeholder. Tax plans, he writes, healthcare policies, evidence of conspiracy theories he claimed were true, the fight against ISIS, the opening of some coal mines, infrastructure plans, all at one point or another were riddles he promised to solve in about 2 weeks. So what takes place in 2 weeks this time?
It's a really good question. As somebody pointed out, Jimmy Kimmel, I think, said he's the guy that loved to say you're fired, and instead he's giving everybody 2 weeks notice on everything. But it never sticks. I mean, the 2 weeks that he wanted to roll out his healthcare plan was 5 years ago, and we're still waiting. So 2 weeks is meaningless. And I think to Rick's point, the problem here is that now everybody and their brother is going to be lobbying him from their own weirdo points of view in his coalition. I mean, think about how he fired most of the members of his National Security Council, including the leader of it, because Laura Loomer, probably the most extreme big influencer in the MAGA world, she is completely crazy. She came into the White House and said he should fire a bunch of people, so he did. God knows whether I know she's lobbying him on the Iran thing. Whether he's listening or not, who knows? But this is not good news for America.
Well, I don't know what's going to come from 2 weeks here, Rick, but we also should allow for other logistical concerns, right? Donald Trump is talking to Benjamin Netanyahu, and if Israel can take care of this on its own, I suspect he would prefer that. And I wonder your thoughts on what deliberations might be taking place inside the Pentagon here with your connections to the defense space, knowing that Israel is considering sending special forces underground into Fordo, that a power outage or another act of sabotage could eliminate these centrifuges, not unlike American B-2s. How do you square all these ideas?
Yeah, look, there are an enormous number of moving parts that are both on our side and on Israel's side. The Nimitz has not gotten on position yet. They'll arrive this weekend. Yeah. We've called up the Eisenhower, a third carrier group, to be put into the Med, and they don't get there until next week. You've mentioned that the Israelis are flexing for ground operations, which they've done successfully in the past, most recently just earlier this week. And the U.S. is flexing for more military capacity and moving our civilian personnel out of embassies right now in the region. So there is a lot happening while the president makes a final decision as to whether or not to use U.S. forces to strike Fordo. And by the way, it does not limit Israel at all doing what they're doing. If anything, we heard it today from the Iranian foreign minister that how are we supposed to negotiate a peace deal if Israel is attacking us every day? And I think most people who watch this space closely would agree the only reason they're willing to talk about peace is because Israel is hurting them every day. And so I think all of this sort of lends some credibility to Donald Trump giving these kinds of 2-week notices that we'll have all our facilities in place. The Defense Department has lots of assets. They're moving to the region. And the president then can still make a decision to go for peace and not for striking, or vice versa. So it doesn't take any options away from the president, but it makes it very clear to the Iranians today that with this kind of firepower, both from the Israeli side and the U.S. side, within 1 week, it's going to be very difficult for them to say anything but uncle.
This is a remarkable moment here, certainly militarily an inflection point. This Operation Pressure Cooker, Matt, has got to be noticed by Iran. There's a lot of questions, though, about the so-called day after. This is the big MAGA question as framed by Steve Bannon or by Tucker Carlson in that interview with Ted Cruz that went on for 2 hours. How worried is Donald Trump about the day after?
You better be pretty worried. I mean, we have seen this movie before. Same region, accusations that WMDs were being developed. We moved in big way, and it went very, very badly, as you may recall, with the Iraq War. So he better worry about that. And I think, Joe, as you and I have discussed on your show before, it isn't just up to the United States as to whether this expands into something more than just a couple of big bombs dropped on Fordo. If we do that, maybe even if we don't, it's up to the Iranians as to whether they want to attack our forces in the region, whether they want to use cyber attacks against the United States, whether they want to use sleeper agents in the United States. They have some agency here too, not a ton. I mean, they don't have any air defense. There's a lot they can't do, but they could widen this conflict even if we didn't want to. So I think it is very, very dangerous. And Trump, as Rick said earlier, Trump was elected on the promise that he's not going to get us entangled in foreign wars. He may not intend to do that, but he could stumble into it as President Bush did, and he's well aware of that.
Rick, you just very effectively described the growing footprint of military hardware, U.S. military hardware, our presence in the region. When you step back and consider the possibilities, what would happen if Iran, in fact, attacked U.S. forces in a world that Matt Bennett is describing?
Yeah, look, I mean, we would react with proportion at a time and place of our choosing. That's one of my favorite terms that the military uses to keep everything on their schedule, not our opponents. And in this case, I would have no doubt that the Defense Department has plans that would incapacitate Iran's ability to launch missiles. You've seen already a lot of that capability degraded from the Israeli attacks, not just on military sites, but where they also manufacture these weapons, and even the power systems that fuel the launch system. So we know as much as Israel does about what the Iranian vulnerabilities are, and we would take advantage of those Iranian vulnerabilities. So it is no doubt in my mind that this would not be a one and done. If we decide to launch a strike on Fedor and think of it as a way of incapacitating a nuclear program with Iran, and Iran does nothing, well, that's a scenario that we could all get used to quick. If then Iran goes after our troops, our facilities in the region, it could pose itself into a much more devastating outcome, both for the United States, but also for Iran. And I would remind everybody, Iran is already attacking us cyber systems all the time. Iran has assassination squads in the United States going after people like John Bolton, who assisted in the assassination of Soleimani. I mean, like, these aren't people who have been behaving themselves and now have the capacity to hurt us. They have been hurting us for decades, and now they are paying a price.
Rick Davis and Matt Bennett. Great panel. Rick, thank you so much, and Matt, have a great weekend. I'm Joe Mathieu. This is Bloomberg. Well, there's not a lot going on in town today. We're waiting to hear from the president on Iran. You've got the House on recess. It's pretty quiet in the nation's capital. There's some important work that's kicking off here in the United States Senate. You hear us talk about the bird bath, the bird droppings, the things that might not end up in the bill. It's getting going now on the Senate Finance Committee's portion of the president's big, beautiful bill. This is the tough stuff in many cases, the controversial tax-related stuff, the Medicaid situation. And we're going to get into it now with somebody who's been on the other side of the bird bath. With our eyes on the Senate, we bring in from the House, Patrick McHenry. Of course, former chair, House Financial Services Committee, former Speaker Pro Temp, Bloomberg contributor. Nice to see you.
Honored to be back.
It's like just me and you in the Capitol today.
This is fantastic.
Quiet
this
around
is like
here.
The place to ourselves.
Well, yeah, and thank you for being here. So there are questions about what's going to make the cut. I'm going to play you Mike Lawler in a minute because he talked to us on Wednesday about holding the line on salt. There's a lot of stuff up in the air here. The Parliamentarian will then have a say. Is there anything beginning with the current policy baseline that could be massively disrupted this weekend?
Well, I think the current policy baseline is the big enchilada, and the major decision, and there'll be a waterfall off of that.
Okay.
So we're going through a set of procedures that every House member hates. So we send over a bill that we think conforms with reconciliation, the law that governs the reconciliation process. It really doesn't have any bearing on the House because we work as a majoritarian institution on a daily, weekly basis. That's what we do. Or they do now, I should say. And then in the Senate, it's complex because you have this cloture threshold. You have these higher standards to do anything. The one example of them having a 50+1 margin for policy that affects budgeting occurs through the reconciliation process. The Senate procedure here puts the power to make that decision the parliamentarian, and with only very rare historic moments has the parliamentarian been overruled.
Aaron McDonough, is that if I remember? Is this a very unpopular person?
Highly unpopular.
Someone you see in the elevator?
Highly unpopular, but also the most popular.
And
right?
most powerful.
Most powerful. So this whole process
hasn't paid for a drink in years.
No, and this process is one that is deeply adjudicated, and the attempt here is to be balanced. Balanced over the 10 and 20 and 30-year basis, not just the 2-year Congress basis. So a lot will be pulled out of this bill, like it always is in every reconciliation package that has happened over the last 20 years.
How predictable is that typically?
It is not predictable.
Okay.
It is not predictable because there are a lot of performative acts going in, a lot of bravado of what the policymaker or those that oppose the policy think is the right outcome, which is obviously their perspective, not anything connected with the rules. It's their whims, their wishes. So what comes out of this is less of a bill than started. That is historic. That is natural for this process. And it will be more frustrating to House members what falls out than what stays in. Which is why you're seeing House members opine about every step of the way, as they should.
So current policy baseline gut check. The Senate knows this is coming. Surely they've been in touch. That would really disrupt this bill. Does it stay in?
I think it stays in.
Okay.
I think it stays in. But these things are very hard to predict. But I think on balance, I think it stays in. That also changes the score for certain policymakers. It doesn't change the score for Wall Street. Wall Street looks at this and says Republicans haven't done enough to reduce the debt and deficit. Haven't turned the tide on our annual deficits. Haven't done anything to address the national debt.
Yeah.
And that is problematic. This is a bill that is by and large a tax extension of current code. When you take that out, the deficit reduction package is a very serious one. It's not as large as the debt reduction package we had 2 years ago under divided government. It's not as large as the divided government debt reduction or deficit reduction package we had under President Obama with Republican leadership in the House. So it is large. It is not a standout in historic terms. The larger ones were done in a large bipartisan package.
When you consider deal breakers here, next in line might be SALT, which is amazing to me that it's come to this. But there was a deal, of course, in the House. If you watch or listen to Bloomberg, you already know it's a big story around here, $40,000. It came out of the Ways and Means Committee at 30. A lot of people thought maybe that's where this would settle down. Senate kicks it back at 10. We don't know anything about SALT on the Senate side.
Cares not at all. Whit.
And we've learned why. Republican senators aren't in blue states where this matters. Mike Lawler is. Your former colleague talked to us about this on Wednesday because the position of the SALT caucus is over my dead body, right? I'm a no vote, not a dime less. Here's Mike Lawler on Bloomberg.
The Senate needs to recognize they can make changes. They can enter into negotiations. But the fact is you need 218 votes to pass this in the House. And there is not a chance in hell that this bill will pass at $10,000, let alone less than $40,000. I guess people, want to try and call our bluff. They tried that in the House. They tried to jam us, and we didn't fold.
Not a chance in hell. This has turned out to be one of the most influential groups in the House because Donald Trump can't primary Representative Lawler with a MAGA candidate, can he?
Well, also these candidates can't go back and campaign as a Republican that they raise their constituents' taxes, which is effectively what this is.
But if he votes no on the bill, he will raise taxes.
But if he votes no on the bill, there is no bill that goes to the president's desk.
Therefore, Trump tax cuts expire and everyone gets a hike, though.
Well, but this is also June. We're still in the month of June. There's a lot of runway here before now and the end of the year. The president wants this bill as quickly as possible to his desk. The end of July has been sort of the natural deadline. July 4th is what the White House is saying.
Yes.
I think if you see the Senate pass this bill by this time next week, or they're in the final landing path for the final vote on this by this time next week, the House will be kept into session. It will be kept in session by President Trump and Speaker Johnson, and the demand will be to take it up and pass it to the president's desk.
They'll be voting on July 3rd.
Which means I think the Senate will come to a compromise that the SALT caucus will agree to. That is above $10,000. It may not be perfectly $40,000. It may not be every stitch of the policy of the House. But the Senate will have to come to terms to fix the House's problem if the president's going to get a bill to the desk before July 4th.
What happens in the meantime to the Ron Johnsons, Rand Pauls? Does the president write them off? He can lose a couple, right?
You can lose a couple, but Rand Paul's taken himself out of the game. He says it will not vote for it because it includes the debt ceiling increase. He's out. But there's still a pathway without Ron Johnson that means you actually have a deficit reduction package and a clean tax extension. There's a lot of wiggle room that all these senators are providing for themselves, save Rand Paul. And I think you're going to see policymakers try to move these policies to a sufficient happy point for them that they can vote for it. They want to be for this. They do not want to stand in favor of a tax increase. And there's a lot of pressure that the president is bringing to bear.
I want to ask you about crypto because he could put some pressure on House members on this too, right? The Genius Act I've thought about you when that passed. I wondered what you were thinking, because that was a pretty big deal. And with all the noise about Iran and everything happening, which is clearly critical and very important, it might not have gotten the coverage that it deserved. But I'll tell you what, we sat here in this very room on the same program, talked to Senator Elizabeth Warren and Senator Also Brooks, two Democrats who have very different takes on this. Senator Also Brooks is trying to make the case for crypto that it is about more than criminals. Will the Elizabeth Warrens in the House accept that argument?
No, I think what you're talking about is a serious policymaker new to the Senate and somebody who has created an avenue to be a gadfly on policy rather than a participant in policymaking. And so the substantive issue here is that we have, for things that are called a stable coin, no federal definition of what that is, only state regulation of stable coins. We have no requirement for us to have audited financials, no federal oversight of this substantial product that is really rising in use and utility, with hundreds of billions of dollars of flow through stable coins now, and no federal regulatory regime. So you would think that the party that favors more regulation generally, the Democratic Party, would say we need to have some say here. You had 68 votes in the Senate to pass the Genius Act to provide a federal regulatory perimeter on things called stablecoins. It's a simple bill, frankly, that we passed out of committee 2 years ago. At this time out of the House of Representatives.
Is the fear that Donald Trump runs wild, making money on crypto, it doesn't crack down on Trump enough, or is the fear that this unlocks the Clarity Act, the new FIT bill that brings us to bear when it comes to Bitcoin?
I think you have partisan Democratic senators and in the House
who in some cases previously approved of this legislation.
Yes, and the optics around President Trump's family being engaged in crypto has told them that they're out, and it's really a hot button political issue that they don't want to touch. These bills address those issues. The question of public office holders owning crypto can be addressed separately in regulation and legislation. It shouldn't stop a 1933 and 1934 Securities and Securities Exchange Act type of legislation for crypto to take hold. It shouldn't stop us regulating financial products at the federal level, because you see what Democratic members see as bad actors within the Trump family on this stuff. That shouldn't inhibit legislation, but it did pull some senators off or give them justification to be a no because they're already anti-crypto. The big news here, though, is that it is a major bipartisan milestone for the Senate to take up crypto legislation, number one. And number two, the Senate Banking Committee has produced now its second piece of major legislation since the financial crisis. Since Dodd-Frank, the Senate Banking Committee has passed Senate Bill 2155, which was a revision to Dodd-Frank, modest in nature, that became law, and now stablecoins. They've done two major things since Dodd-Frank passage. I think that we should herald, because it's serious policymaking, a serious undertaking from a serious committee, and we should welcome that as a functioning piece of government and commend everybody who wanted to participate and to get to a good outcome.
Well, it did take Democrats to pass it in the Senate. We'll see what happens on the House side. I want to ask you about Iran in our remaining couple of moments here, because the president's facing a major decision, and you've been involved, or were in your time as a member of Congress, in debates around authorizing use of force. In some cases, they were bent into pretzels to keep them working in places like Iran and Afghanistan. At what point will Congress need to have a say in something if the president decides to take action?
Well, it depends how significant the action is.
This is 30 to 60 days, typically. Is there more to it than that?
It is, and it depends how lasting this action is. If you're talking about regime change, I think that is a significant shaker. That's why you see skepticism on MAGA loyalists that want us pulling back from the world. And they're saying, do not get into the question of regime change. We saw what happened in Iraq. We need to learn our lessons. Now, the question is, what are those measures that we can take to stop Iran's nuclear program? Can we be of aid and assistance to Israel, like it appears that we currently are? Should we ramp that up a degree or 50 degrees, depending on your perspective? There is a divide among President Trump's loyalists on this, on what is the right approach. I think what we're going to see here is a Trump doctrine that comes as a result of that, that is neither isolationist nor fully engaged in the international community.
Fascinating. You think we find out in less than 2 weeks?
I think we find out within days.
Fascinating. Always great to see you. Patrick McHenry, Bloomberg Politics contributor, of course, former chair of the House Financial Services Committee, a man who's held the gavel as former Speaker Pro Tem. Great to see you. Thank you so much, as always. I'm Joe Mathieu in Washington. We'll meet you back here on the 5 p.m. late edition of Balance of Power on Bloomberg. Make sure to subscribe to the Balance of Power podcast. In the meantime, go to Apple, Spotify, anywhere you get your podcasts, and hear our full conversation with Patrick McHenry. You can also listen anytime at the website. It's Bloomberg.com.